He could have shot her. It would have been the simplest thing. One clean shot, and the unforgiving snow would have handled the rest. But he hesitated. His rifle, usually an extension of his own arm, suddenly felt foreign. Weighed down not by its own steel, but by the words she'd just spoken. They settled in his gut like a hot stone. He had her, kneeling in the snow, her breath pluming in the frigid air, hands empty and open. She was barely more than a girl, a thin shawl her only defense against a world that had clearly tried to chew her up and spit her out. Her hair was a tangled mess of sweat and pine needles. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She wasn't weeping. And she wasn't begging for her life. Not in the way most do. She looked him square in the eye, and with a stillness that chilled him more than the blizzard, she stated her terms. "Let me live," she said. The voice that came from her wasn't that of a girl facing death. It was a merchant stating a price. "I will give you sons. They will be strong." The rifle barrel dipped. But that wasn't the beginning. The beginning was 3 days prior. For 5 years, Colt Traver was a man who cast a single shadow. He moved through the world leaving no tracks, no ties, nothing but the dust his horse kicked up. He wasn't a man settlements were built to hold. He'd ride in, take a quiet drink, and be gone before the morning light, carrying nothing but a saddlebag and a piece of lead under his ribs he'd carried longer than any friend. He was a man without a reason to stop. Until the sky tore open 30 miles shy of Red Elk Ridge. He'd been tracking a deer, something to quiet the gnawing in his belly. But the weather turned on him with a vengeance. The snow flew not down, but across, like a swarm of angry ghosts whipping through the timber. He found shelter under a lip of limestone, his small fire a lone orange star against the crushing white. He was feeding it slivers of pine when a sound cut through the wind's howl. The sharp crack of a branch under a desperate foot. It wasn't the careful step of wildlife. It was clumsy, hurried, barefoot, by the sound of it. Too frantic for a hunter, too slow for an escape. He was on his feet in an instant, rifle in hand, and stepped into the clearing just as she burst from the tree line. She looked like something the storm had coughed up, dress in tatters, face pale and raw from the wind. Her eyes found his immediately. They weren't pleading. They were assessing, sizing him up. She stumbled once on the icy ground, caught her footing with a grit that surprised him, and then stood 10 paces away, her chest rising and falling like a trapped bird's. He didn't move a muscle. Neither did she. He raised the rifle, just enough to make his point. She didn't so much as flinch. She just took a single, deliberate step forward, and whispered that first plea. "Please, don't shoot." And then came the offer that had knocked the wind out of him. The one she'd clearly rehearsed in 100 nightmares. "I will give you sons. They will be strong." Colt didn't answer right away. He kept the barrel up. What in God's name was a girl doing out here, in the heart of a blizzard, with no coat and a bargain like that on her tongue? He scanned her face, looking for the kind of truth people only tell when they believe they're already dead. He saw no fear. Only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He finally lowered the rifle a few inches. "Where'd you come from?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. "A place not worth returning to," she said. He didn't push. He just nodded toward his meager camp with the muzzle of his gun. "Fire's over there. Might as well use it." She watched him for a long moment, then walked toward the flame, each step careful, as if she was afraid of spooking a wild animal. Or of being seen as one. Once she reached the shelter of the overhang, her legs gave out. She crumpled to her knees, stretching her raw, bare hands toward the tiny, flickering fire as if it were a god. Colt sat a few feet away, his rifle resting across his lap. The choice was still there, sitting between them in the cold air. heavier than ever. For a long time, the only sound was the hiss and pop of the fire, a fragile heartbeat in the vast, frozen silence. He watched her. Not as a man watches a woman, but as a tracker studies a trail, piecing together a story from what was left behind. In the flickering light, he saw the ghost of a bruise on her collarbone, a faint yellow shadow against pale skin. He saw the thin, white line on her wrist when she reached for another piece of wood. Not the jagged mark of an accident, but the straight, deliberate line of a brand. He said nothing about them, but she knew he'd seen. Her shoulders tensed just for a moment. He finally broke the silence, his voice low. "That bargain you offered," he said. "You keep that ready for moments like this?" She stared into the flames. "It's the only currency some men understand," she answered, her voice flat. He frowned. "Children?" "No," she said. "The offer itself. It makes a person seem too desperate to be a threat." He looked at the scars again. "Who are you running from?" She took a slow breath. "From men who believe they own the sun because it shines on their land." His grip tightened on the rifle in his lap. "Runaway wife?" She shook her head, a small, bitter motion. "Not a wife. Just purchased." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and cold. He said nothing more. He just handed her his canteen. She drank slowly, carefully. When she handed it back, her eyes met his. "You gonna take me back?" she asked. He considered it. He could. He could ride into Red Elk Ridge with her in tow, earn a quiet nod from the sheriff, maybe a few dollars for his trouble. He could wash his hands of the whole affair. Instead of answering, he asked a question of his own. "What do they call you?" She hesitated, as if the name itself was a secret she wasn't sure he'd earned. Then, so quietly it was almost lost to the wind, she said, "Meera." He nodded once. A slow, final gesture. And at last, he laid the rifle down beside him. 2 days later, the snow stopped. The world was born anew in clean, white silence. They reached a pass in the canyon by midday. To the east, the smoke of Red Elk Ridge was a smudge against the horizon. Safety for him. A cage for her. He stopped his horse and looked that way for a long time. Meera sat still on her own mount, not saying a word, just watching him. Waiting. Then, without a word, he turned his horse west. They rode for an hour before she finally spoke, her voice cutting through the quiet. "You're not taking me to them." It was a statement, not a question. He shook his head. "No." "Why?" He adjusted the reins in his hands, his gaze fixed on the broken landscape ahead. "My whole life," he said slowly, "I've watched men take whatever they wanted, just because no one had the spine to tell them no. I guess I got tired of watching. The first sign wasn't a sound, but a story told in mud by a stream. 3 sets of tracks. Shod horses, ridden hard, with no pack gear. These weren't travelers. They were hunters." Colt crouched by the water's edge for a long time, tracing their path. He knew the kind of men who rode like that. Men who smiled while they caused pain. A cold memory surfaced. A man from a Kansas City job, who bragged about a runaway girl, and who hummed a particular tune right before things got ugly. Colt could still hear it in his mind. He moved back to their camp fast, but without panic. When Meera saw his face, she didn't ask what was wrong. She simply put down the sticks she was sharpening and asked, "How many?" 3, he said. "Tilson's men." Her knuckles went white, but her voice stayed even. "Where do we go?" They rode hard into the fading light, toward a place Colt remembered. An old stone quarry that fell away into the earth like a sudden wound. A 60-foot drop of cold, gray silence. He tied off the horses and helped her down the narrow switchback path. The floor of the quarry was sheltered, a natural fortress, and a perfect trap. "We stay here," he said. "They'll think twice before coming in after us." "And if they don't?" she whispered. "Then I shoot first." They built no fire that night. Darkness was their only shield. And in that darkness, Colt heard it. A low whistle, carried on the wind. The same humming tune from Kansas City. Meera froze beside him. "They're here." A voice echoed down from the quarry rim, cocky and cruel. "Colt Traver, we heard you picked up some stray property." Colt stood slowly, rifle in hand. Another voice laughed. "Just hand the girl over, Traver, and we'll walk away. No need for blood." Meera stepped up beside him, her eyes locked on the shadows above. "Don't," he hissed. But she ignored him. "If I go back, you'll kill me slowly," she called out, her voice clear and strong. The whistler spoke then. "That's the idea, girl." She took another step forward. "Then come and take me." The first shot answered her challenge, slamming into the rock wall inches from her head. She didn't scream. She just looked at Colt, her eyes burning with a terrible fire. "If they hit me," she said, her voice low and fierce, "make it count. No stray shots." Then they appeared at the edge, three dark shapes against the moonlit sky. Colt took a breath, lined up the barrel, and fired. The first shadow dropped without a sound. The second returned fire, bullets screaming past Colt's cheek, drawing blood. Meera ducked, not in fear, but to scoop the revolver from the first fallen man's belt. She'd never held one, but she pointed it with two steady hands. The third man froze, startled by the sight of her, the broken property now armed and defiant. That hesitation was all Colt needed. His second shot echoed in the stone pit. And the third man fell. Silence. The whistler was gone. Vanished back over the ridge. Meera let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. And the heavy revolver fell from her hands. Colt slumped against the rock wall, the sting on his cheek a sharp reminder he was still alive. She was beside him in an instant, tearing a strip from her dress, pressing it to his wound. Neither of them spoke. The moon rose higher, spilling silver light onto two souls who had just fought their way out of the dark, together. Colt didn't sleep much that night. Not from the sting on his cheek, but from the new kind of silence that had settled over them. It was a heavy, final silence, the kind that comes after a door has been slammed shut on an old life. Meera stayed beside him. Her hands never trembled as she cleaned the wound. She worked with the quiet competence of someone who had patched up broken things her whole life. "You could have run," he said quietly into the darkness. "Back there, before the shooting started." She looked at him, her eyes seeming older in the moonlight. "I did run. For years." She took a breath. "That first night, in the blizzard, when you found me, I hoped you would shoot." He stared at her. "Because a bullet would have been clean," she continued, her voice devoid of any pity for herself. "It would have been quick. Not like them. I've been passed around since I was 12. Men like Tilson, they see girls like me the way a rancher sees livestock. Useful only for what you can get out of us." Colt's jaw tightened. "I grew up on a ranch," he said, his voice a low rumble. "My mother would have tanned my hide if I ever looked at a living creature and thought it was mine just because I was the one feeding it." For the first time, a small, dry laugh escaped her lips. "She sounds like someone I would have liked." She paused, then looked at him again. "You're the first man who's ever said something like that without expecting something in return." He shrugged, uncomfortable with the weight of her words. "I'm not a good man, Meera." "No," she agreed softly. "But you're a decent one. And that's rarer." She shifted closer, just a little, and leaned her head against his shoulder. It wasn't a lover's touch. It was the weary gesture of a soldier finding a moment's peace beside a fellow survivor. He didn't move. He sat as still as the stone walls around them, and let her rest. "I don't know who I am without the running," she whispered. He tilted his head toward the slice of starry sky above. "You figure it out," he said. "You just start walking, and you don't look back." They left the quarry at dawn. They headed west, further than most people ever went, past where the roads turned into deer paths and the creeks ran clear and unnamed. They found a place where the land was quiet and the sky was immense. And they built a life. The cabin wasn't pretty, but the roof didn't leak. He planted beans and cursed them when the frost came early. She learned to shape cups from river clay. They argued over the right way to salt meat. They laughed at things that weren't funny to anyone else. Some nights, they just sat and listened to the fire crackle, comfortable in a silence they had earned together. There were 2 rules in that cabin, though they were never spoken aloud. He never touched her without asking first. And she never asked for permission to speak her mind. In those 2 unspoken truths, they built something stronger than any paper vows. And one afternoon, she took the name they'd called her back in that other life, and she buried it in the soft earth behind the house, leaving it to be forgotten. A year passed, then another, and slowly, remarkably, the quiet no longer sounded like hiding. It sounded like peace. One morning, a rider was passing through, young, dusty, and polite, headed east. Colt offered him water from their well. Meera came out onto the porch and handed him a piece of bread wrapped in cloth, her eyes sharp but not unkind. As the boy was leaving, he tipped his hat. "This your place?" he asked. Colt looked toward the porch, where Meera had already turned to go back inside, her apron fluttering for a moment in the breeze. He smiled a small, private smile, and said to the boy, "Yeah, I am." They never had children. Instead, Meera taught 2 orphan girls from a passing wagon train how to weave rope so strong it could pull a calf from the mud. Instead, Colt built a sturdy bridge over the creek, so no one else would lose a mule trying to cross during the spring thaw. Their names were never written in any book. Their story was never told from a pulpit. Years later, the preacher's son from Red Elk Ridge passed through their valley. A grown man now, heavy with his own regrets. He saw the faint, white mark on Meera's wrist as she handed him a cup of water. He didn't ask. He just lowered his eyes and said, so quietly it was almost an apology to God himself, "I'm sorry." Meera simply nodded once, and turned to continue hanging her laundry in the sun. She didn't need his apology. She had already granted her own forgiveness, long ago. When Colt died, it was like the turning of a season. No drama, no gunshot, just the quiet end of a long road he had walked exactly the way he'd chosen. Beside the only person who ever saw him as more than a rifle and a scar. Meera buried him under the tallest cottonwood tree on their land. She marked it with a flat river stone she carved herself. It didn't say much. It said only one thing. He chose to spare me. And I chose to live. And she did. Every single day after. In sunlight. In silence. In strength.